The Bengals are set to franchise tag Tee Higgins, and with him back in the fold for 2024, I have a question about the past. Yes, we look at Jessie Bates' departure and if the Bengals made the right decision. Hi again, everyone, and welcome in to Enter the Jungle. I'm James Rapien, and he is Andrew Fox Miller. We're with you every single Tuesday night at 8 Eastern right here on Cincinnati Bengals Talk Weekly on Bally Sports. And as always, shout out to the Big Play Network for, well, having us, because we couldn't be more excited to be part of Big Play and Bally Sports. So with that being said, Andrew, there is a big question, elephant in the room this offseason. Paul Dehner Jr. is going to join us coming up in just a little bit to discuss Tee Higgins' future. But all of this Tee Higgins talk got me thinking about Jessie Bates, the ex-star safety, the drafted and developed star that went elsewhere, the guy who played on the tag, the guy who has the same agent as Tee Higgins and David Mulligetta, all of these things. There's a lot of parallels. And it's easy to see. I think all of our viewers right now watch Jessie Bates from afar, at least in Atlanta, and whether it was his 132 tackles, 6 interceptions, 1 pick six, it's pretty clear. Jessie Bates is a heck of a football player. It would have been nice for him to be on the Bengals. But how easy would it have been to keep him? I looked at the numbers. I looked at his contract, and I have all of the numbers in front of me, and it's kind of wild because, Andrew, let me just ask you this. If you could, would you trade Jermaine Pratt, who's under contract, Joe Mixon, who's under contract, and Nick Scott, who's under contract? Would you trade those three
Yes.
for Jessie Bates?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, I'll throw Logan Wilson in there. Maybe Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt. Would you do that even though they're the same position for Jessie Bates?
That's a big hole at linebacker we're dealing with.
Because it's the same position, but
Yeah,
you would value. So let's do this then. Would you do Wilson, Mixon, Scott? Of course you would.
Yeah.
Right. If you still had Pratt or if you still had a serviceable linebacker, because I get it. And I look back at the Bates deal and his cap hits, they're not crazy. So 6 years or 4 years, $64 million. He had a $9.5 million cap hit in 2023 to be a Pro Bowler for the Falcons. Why the back end of the Bengals secondary was reeling and giving up big plays. I think Noah Brown just caught another pass against them as we were speaking here on Enter the Jungle. And it's wild because I look and it's $36 million guaranteed, which is essentially the first 2 years. But he had a $9 million cap hit last year. Joe Mixon had an $8 million cap hit. Nick Scott had a $2.4 million cap hit. So if you just take those two guys alone, don't even get into the linebackers, that would have been enough to have Jessie Bates on the roster. And then, well, the cap hit goes up to 17.5 this year and then 18.5 the following 2 years of that deal in 25 and 26. But it would have been worth it. And I'm not saying that you can completely make this the logic when it comes to Tee Higgins, because I think they are different players. But I think it is fair to say now, regardless of what the Bengals do at safety, regardless of how good Dax Hill or Jordan Battle become, because they could end up being really, really good players. I'm not dismissing that. The Bengals got it wrong with Jessie Bates because they paid guys like Jermaine Pratt, Joe Mixon, Nick Scott, and even Logan Wilson, who I would have extended to. But you could have just paid Jessie Bates. And the reason they didn't, a big reason why, Andrew, they do not like going and giving multi-year guarantees. And Jessie Bates essentially got 2 years in guaranteed money. The Bengals have only done that with one guy, Joe Burrow. So, that really cost them because Jessie Bates was a big, big factor. And in hindsight, at least in hindsight, he should be in Cincinnati right now.
That's the thing. This is the guaranteed money. I kept thinking that, wondering that the whole time. So I'm glad you brought that up. With that said, is there a lesson learned on the T side? Or are they just going to keep doing Bengals deals the way they do Bengals deals? Because it's a moot point potentially, right?
It is when it comes to T. And that's why I don't think the parallels are completely the same. One, you could say wide receiver is more valuable than safety, which I get. I think Jessie Bates is a higher end safety, probably top 5 safety in the NFL versus T, who's not a top 5 wide receiver. He's up there, but he's not a top 5 wide receiver. At the same time, I look at it and I see, oh, well, Jessie Bates is really durable. He plays. He played every snap, at least 100% of the snaps, according to Pro Football Reference. Maybe he was on the sideline for a snap here or there, but they rounded up. The point is, he was on the field for all 17 games for the Falcons. You can't say that about T, so I don't want to say the parallels are perfect. But I do think it's fair to say be leery when you hear of these big deals, even with Burrow. People are critical of the Burrow contract at times. Sometimes it's just worth it to have great players. Jessie Bates, at worst, would be their second best defensive player this coming season, and probably their best in 2023. You could say Trey Hendrickson too, fine. Let's say he'd be their second best defensive player and a top 5 player on the roster. That's worth paying for, because I look at this team, and after Tee Higgins, I'm not sure who they're going to pay outside of Jamar Chase. There aren't many guys that are lining up ready to be paid, and Jessie Bates was one of those guys, and they let him walk. So are there parallels with T? I think there are some, but it's also like when you find these elite guys, just keep them and be willing to give that second year and guaranteed money, which I kind of get why they wouldn't do it with T. I probably would, but with his health, I agree that that's a factor in the durability aspect of it.
And when you talk about Jessie Bates, by the way, and we could probably talk quickly about parallels with T in this regard, if you're going to give guaranteed money, also maybe an added bonus is veteran leadership in the locker room, especially when we talk about safety at that position, sorely needed. Kind of, I'm assuming they hoped they were going to have that with Von Bell still there, which wasn't the case. So yeah, there's an element of that as well that they lost. And if you're going to pay someone guaranteed money, have them not only establish as a player on the field, but a leader in the locker room off the field.
It's a great point. If they had paid either of those safeties, but let's say Jessie Bates, I don't think there's any conversation about Dax Hill potentially being a bust or moving him, because they would have fit perfectly together. But let's go down a tier and say they decided to pay Von Bell. The communication, he was a talker, communicating on the back end. He would have been able to help Dax Hill in his development, help Jordan Battle in his development. And instead they lose that. You lose both pieces. And that's kind of where they are now. That's why they are where they are. At least with T, to your point, they do have Jamar. And so, if anything, if you could take a time machine back, I would have been far more critical. And I think I was critical in general, but we just kind of accepted that Jessie Bates was going elsewhere. It shouldn't have happened. They should have broke the bank. They should have broke the precedent to keep him here. Instead, safety is a big question mark. And so is Tee Higgins' future in Cincinnati. Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic did a 4-part series on T, his future, and you'll hear part of our conversation with Paul about Tee Higgins coming up next. Welcome back to Enter the Jungle. I'm James Rapien, and I was able to catch up with Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic to discuss Tee Higgins' future and likelihood that they franchise tag their star wide receiver. So without further ado, let's get to my conversation with PDJ.
When they have big decisions to make, when they have large holes to fill, what do? They fill them a year early and let it develop and make sure that it's right to take over. That's been who they are forever, since Duke Tobin has been in the room. And so the fact that, they haven't really filled that. They drafted Charlie Jones and Andre Yoshavash, but that was, certainly Jones was more with an eye on Tyler Boyd, and Yoshavash was a 6th-round pick. There was no setting something in line for the next stage beyond Tee Higgins. Well, they have an opportunity to do that this draft. Certainly, if you use a 2nd or a 3rd-round pick and he gets some time, he develops in the background, you do that with the eye that in 2025 he's ready to step in, and you have a better feel of that person can step in and be the next Tee Higgins, or Andre Yoshavash took a huge jump and he could be the next Tee Higgins, or whatever it is. But that doesn't exist right now. There is no like, hey, the next Tee Higgins is already here. And so because of that, I think that's where you end up with where they think they're at, which is one more shot with T in this route, and you're replacing Tyler Boyd, almost certainly with a younger player. That could be a pick. That could be Charlie Jones. That could be a free agent, whatever. But I think that's because you can always look at that. They're always looking a year ahead. And so when you're trying to see how they view it and where they're at, that's a big part of it. And one more thing I'll pop on the back of it is what they look at is 121 snaps. 121 snaps from 2023 where a fully healthy Joe Burrow, Tee Higgins, and Jamar Chase were on the field together. That's about 6 times fewer than the previous year. What a glorious 121 snaps they were. If you snap out that sample size, it was the most efficient, explosive offense in football. When they were out there, they just feel like this is what they were building for. They fixed the line to serviceability. They had T and Jamar. They just didn't get the full year of it. They want to see the full year of it. They want to go out there and know that can bring a title. And so that combined with the fact that they don't have the answer in-house, I think gives you a sense of how they feel about where they're at in building the roster and building out the receiver room for Joe.
So why not just resign him? And I say just knowing it's going to be 25-ish million per, knowing that they would have to guarantee a second year, which they don't do unless your name's Joe Burrow or whenever they sign Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase, I get that, which that's a whole nother conversation. But with Tee Higgins, I don't think there are many Tee Higginses in this draft. And I don't think that there's going to be many available at 18. Now, could one of them develop in this draft that's drafted at 18 or beyond into Tee Higgins? Sure. But it's not like you could just say, oh, Brian Thomas is the next Tee Higgins. Or even in a good wide receiver draft, it's hard to find him. And so why not go that route? What's the logic there? Because it doesn't feel like they're going to. It doesn't feel like they're going to be able to get a deal done. And I'm not sure they necessarily want to get a deal done knowing what his market is.
Correct. I think one, he will get a deal that will look not like Bengals deals. Whenever he signs somewhere else, if it's assuming he signs somewhere else, it won't look like what you see when you see those Bengals deals come off. Like
guaranteed
they'll just look
money,
at
baby.
Guaranteed money. And if you and it should, if you look at the precedent of the money that people of his level have been paid, it has had $40+ million guarantees at minimum. It's 3 and 4 years. It's these huge, and that's just not somewhere the Bengals are gonna go with Tee Higgins. Partially something you mentioned. Look, no one is doubting Tee Higgins' willingness to play through injury. The fact that he has played through every season, he's been a postseason star. He's had touchdowns in the Super Bowls and championship games. He's pushed himself out on the field playing through a hamstring this past year when it was bleak. Credit him that. But he is a guy that's always had a nagging something. And he has not even had, he hasn't crossed 760 snaps in a season the last 3 years. Okay. It's been a game here, 2 games there, a hamstring here, a thing there. And it's always kind of been, so when you're talking about, if you're going to do the big investment, I go back to Duke Tobin told us this a couple years ago. If you're going to do the big investment, this is after the Super Bowl, go after the big fish. It better be worth it. And they're going to want to be paying for availability too. And in a league where you can find the next Tee Higgins, you know what I mean? Like second round, third round, and with a year to develop. And this team, by the way, pretty decent history with second round receivers, pretty decent history with drafting and developing receivers, is something you can lean into, is why you don't go to a salary structure you're not comfortable with and an availability that maybe makes you a little bit uncomfortable in the long haul. But for 1 year of 25-year-old Tee Higgins, they're willing to take the risk and sign it up and say that $20.7 million is worth it.
I'll continue my conversation with Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic about Tee Higgins and the Bengals options coming up next. Welcome back into Enter the Jungle. I'm James Rapien, and let's get back to my conversation with Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic about Tee Higgins and his future in Cincinnati. I would look at it and say, all right, well, I'm either going to tag and trade him or say he's a big part of our team in 2024 and beyond. And instead, they're trying to split the difference. But I think it's going to be really hard to do because they have so many other needs as well. And that's why I would be hesitant to do what they're going to do, which is tag him and let him play out the 2024 season.
You know, I go back to the Karate Kid with this, James, and that is
Oh man.
either you do it yes or you do it no. You do it the middle. Like it's feels like
Yep.
it's trying to please two different sides. I'm with you on that. I don't disagree. I think if you're what is your path forward? Have a confident path forward, one side or the other. The problem is, I just feel like they think that this combination can win a Super Bowl, and they're right in that because they basically have. You know what I mean? They've been right there twice, and
Yeah.
so why not take one more shot at it right before you go taking the chance that you lose them? I understand
Take
the
4 shots at it
sustainability.
with a
Yeah,
4-year deal. Take 4 shots.
but
I
then now, then what happens when you are combining Chase's money, Higgins' money, Burrow's money all down the line? You end up in places. Now I wonder, and this is a discussion point I had with a couple people around the league, is the league now changing to where there's more acceptance to do that due to the value of the receiver? Or does what we just watched with Kansas City and what we actually just watched across the entire playoffs? Look at the teams at the end. Look at Zay Flowers invigorates Baltimore. Sam Laporta comes in Detroit and invigorates Detroit. Rashee Rice's emergence changes the game for Kansas City. At a certain point, you also have to be looking at it that way. And the idea of putting that much money into Chase, Higgins, and Burrow and hamstringing yourself in other places is a challenge to their sustainability in the long run, too. And so, again, there's so many tentacles that cross each other, and you end up going in circles a lot of times. And I think it feels to me like their view is going to be of, let's just focus on right now. Let's go win a title, right? And that's different than we've heard from them. But I do think that is where they end up in a lot of these conversations.
So when I see, okay, I'm never going to argue that, but let's just say that's the logic. Then push all the chips in, or you're really pushing the limit cap wise, and you're really going. You're not rolling over $8 million because you want to go get that backup guard that can also back up Ted Karras in both guard spots, or get a swing tackle in free agency, even though you already signed a tackle. I'm just throwing out ideas. Really do it, because if you don't and you dip your toe in that area, but you don't go all the way, well, you could look up, have 3 offensive line injuries over the final 3 weeks of the season and have to go to Arrowhead with, with multiple guys that you don't want starting blocking for Joe Burrow, Tee Higgins, and Jamar Chase, which is a really tough place to be in. And so I just pick your lane to a degree. I'm never going to argue with a team trying to go win a title, even if it's for 1 year. The window is going to be longer than that, but really push. Not that they haven't tried. I'm not saying that, but really push the limits if you can, if that's the logic with T.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they feel like that is pushing in. I mean, putting the 20.7 and then building around it is pushing all in and not sacrificing sustainability down the line. They can still, but on the other side of it is, I mean, Chase's money is obviously eventually going to be a thing, but they don't really have other big extent because the drafts coming up aren't full of guys that they're, Cam Taylor Britt's extension will probably be the McPherson. We're talking kicker money. I mean, it's not like there's a line of people that are
Wait a
there.
second. You're telling me Jackson Carman isn't getting an extension?
Telling you that. Yeah. And so when you're talking about, when you are talking about not having to worry, you feel like it can be something that you can do right now and pile that money in right now. And the way that they did last year with Orlando Brown, where they front loaded a ton of money and just said, pile a bunch of money in right now. And this is part of also how Burrow set it up, right? I mean, when he said my extension won't kick in until 25 and you're going to have me at $29 million on the cap, 5th-year option year this year. Well, guess what? That almost adds up to exactly the difference in cap hit of what you're paying Tee Higgins. Of Burrow plus Higgins this year is basically Burrow next year. So it feels almost like that's baked in.
Really good stuff from Paul Dehner Jr. of The Athletic. You can catch that entire interview right here on Cincinnati Bengals Talk. Up next, the Bengals offensive coaching staff appears to be finalized. Get to know the newest member of Zac Taylor's crew.
James, news. We thought coaching news may have been over, but we did get some recent news here, and that is Jordan Salkin was hired from the outside, University of Oregon, to be on the Bengals coaching staff as offensive assistant. So I don't know much about Jordan as a coach. I don't know much about his background. Hoping you can kind of fill us in on some information about him and tell us what it means for the team.
Former quarterback, another quarterback joins the staff, and he worked with Bo Nix at the University of Oregon last year. And you look at it, the first thing I thought of was Bo Nix. Of course, the Bengals aren't in on drafting him, but Troy Franklin, wide receiver, could be in the top 50 picks or so of the NFL draft. Interested in him. Jackson Powers Johnson, someone I've talked about here on Enter the Jungle. And then Bucky Irving, a mid-round running back out of Oregon. So he gives you some unique perspective on those draft prospects that the Bengals could be interested in. But he's got NFL experience with the Miami Dolphins, and he brings that outside perspective that I think a lot of fans wanted from an offensive mind. So the Bengals added Freddie Knighton a few years ago as an offensive assistant. He moves into that assistant quarterbacks coach role behind Brad Cragthorpe. And so they bring in Jordan Salkin as someone to help fill out that offensive staff. So Zac Taylor's staff, at least on the offensive side of the ball, appears finalized. Hopefully we'll get to know these guys at the NFL Combine coming up. But it's going to be interesting to see how his perspective could impact this draft, because he's coming from the college game and he's played against, or coached against rather, a lot of these different prospects that the Bengals will be evaluating. So we will have you covered. All things NFL draft, all things Bengals offseason, including the NFL Combine, which is next week, quickly approaching in Indianapolis. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on Cincinnati Bengals Talk. And until next time, for Andrew Fox Miller, I'm James Rapien. Thank you so much for watching Enter the Jungle.